This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 24th, the Institute hosted the fourth in its series of annual conferences on themes in defense and security studies. This year's conference focused on global challenges to Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic.
Everything that they have to say. So I look forward to their presentations. Well, I appreciate being invited to speak here, and I just want to apologize. I'm using notes because there are an awful lot of numbers and amounts in there that I don't trust memory. My presentation this afternoon will focus on potential economic and opportunities. I was given the title threats, but I'm using challenges of Arctic warming. And the Centennial quote you see there above is basically a reference to the relative underdevelopment of our Arctic resources compared to other circumpolar countries and the need for a more clearly defined policy of future guidance. Okay, it works. While it is important to consider the Arctic from a circumpolar perspective, please disregard the Arctic Circle. It was an imaginary line by ancient Greek astronomers. Scientists and climatologists prefer the July 10 degrees centigrade isotherm line. It's red on your right map. And some even use the tree line, which is there in green. But note that both of these will change as air and surface temperatures change. Social scientists, on the other hand, tend to include the subarctic in their studies, which in Canada involves Northern First Nations. For the Canadian Arctic, I'll be focusing on the boundaries of the NORDREG zone, both the shaded waters and adjacent land. You may already know, but NORDREG is the name of the Canadian Coast Guard's Arctic traffic system, which is mandatory for vessels 300 tons or more, who must report their identity, position, proposed route, and destination to the Coast Guard prior to entering Canadian Arctic waters. And in return, NORDREG tracks their progress, supplies updated ice reports, and if necessary, Icebreaker Escort. Now, basically, a lot of the small craft that are well under 300 tons are also using this voluntarily because of the ice reports. Global warming consensus. It's warming at a far greater rate than anywhere else and more rapidly than anticipated. But the rate of change may vary weekly. But as an overview, this image is based on surface temperatures relative to the global mean from 1951 to 2017. So that's how much more it is affecting the Arctic. A key factor to consider when assessing opportunities is the extent of sea ice. Now, this extent is not solid ice. It can be broken ice too, but it has to be less than 15% of the total. These and other satellite images show a steady decrease since the 1960s. This other satellite images are more monthly, yearly, etc. But especially along the coast of Russia and Norway and Finland, which resulted in increased shipping along the Northern Sea route. This map of, you've seen this before, Arctic shipping routes. It was published in 2018, but it shows only one route through the Northwest Passage marked in red, likely because it was the only one open in 2017. There are actually 5 more clearly defined routes marked here in very light gray. And also barely visible is the Arctic Bridge route, beginning at Port Churchill on Hudson Bay, once used to carry grain to Russia until the port was shut in 2016. The Northern Sea route is in green and is by far the most heavily used, both as a trade route for foreign ships and by Russian ships to export its Arctic minerals and energy sources. Oops. That's sensitive. Also note that the routes to the Svalbard Islands are increasingly a popular destination for cruise ships. Nope. I'm missing one. There. One factor contributing to Arctic warming is beyond our control, and that's the circumpolar region has large, huge areas of permafrost, both continuous and discontinuous. As it melts, pipelines, roads, buildings, airfields, and the coastline are the first to show visible signs of damage. Not visible is the release of large quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which combine to further accelerate the warming trend. I usually refer to it as a domino effect. In a recent study, research published just last month reported that the thawing permafrost in Alaska may release 12 times as much as originally considered. And nitrous oxide is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and it can trap radiation, more radiation than methane or carbon dioxide, and it lasts much longer in the atmosphere. The largest concentrations, of course, are in Siberia and Arctic Canada, and a critical consideration when you're thinking of future development. The warming Arctic offers a number of economic opportunities. Increased use of the Northern Sea route as a trade route is obvious, but less so for the Northwest Passage, but it might be more attractive for cruise ships. A longer season, or better access to minerals and energy resources, a longer season for supplying goods to the Arctic communities, expansion of both local and commercial fishing, potential growth for a land-based tourist industry. I'll deal with the above, but not necessarily in order of importance. Published in 2015, this map shows both existing development and potential sites. Mines are developed with identified with red squares, triangles for oil and gas wells. If redrawn today, there would be far more black triangles off the shore of Siberia. Gas, not oil. Orange areas represent known oil gas reserves, and the fields not yet explored, but considered potential, are differentiated. Beige for medium potential offshore, brown for high. On land, it's high potential in olive green and medium and sand covered. The dotted green lines represent proposed pipelines, or dotted green lines. Solid green lines represent existing ones, and look at the number in Russia and Norway, Eastern Europe. In Alaska, oil production in Prudhoe Bay is declining, but still carried by pipeline to Valdez. By comparison, there's far greater resource potential in the Russian Arctic. The government is fast-tracking further development. And according to a recent article in the New York Times, 20% of Russia's gross domestic product now comes from the Arctic. It's Arctic, not ours. And it will continue to grow even more under the current 5-year plan. Based on market demand, Russia's current plan is to increase gas production, not oil. And this is just an example. In the first 6 months last year, 2018, that's January to June, 5 ice-reinforced LNG tankers made 34 trips to Europe, the majority to the Netherlands and to France, from its new LNG terminal at Yamal, which is seen on the left. It's huge. Later last summer, tankers carried LNG eastward to China and Southeast Asia. And the use of the Northern Sea route as a trade route has also grown. In spite of the massive number of trips that it challenged, and I'm talking about foreign-owned vessels, there were 20, which included only tankers, bulk cargo ships, and a container ship. I didn't put the cruise ships in there. And they've made a full transit, 7 from Atlantic to Pacific and 13 Pacific to Atlantic. And this list does not include any Russian ships, military vessels, icebreakers, research vessels, or foreign-owned cruise ships. And the thing is that they also pay a fee for use of the route. In other words, the Northern Sea route is now an established foreign trade route. The Northwest Passage, I agree with Bob Ray, not yet in any stretch of the imagination. This chart was published in 2015, but the percentages are similar when a total of 29 vessels completed a full transit of the Northwest Passage. In contrast to the NSR, most were small yachts, sailboats, passenger ships. I call them small cruise ships, 100 to 200 passengers. Most, if not all, took a southern route in 2017 because of ice conditions. A number of the small cruise ships also made incomplete transits of the passage, usually from Coppermine or Iqaluit to the Atlantic Ocean, back and forth. For those interested, though, note the website address down there. You can actually track the number of ships currently on the world's largest bodies of water on the Marine Graphic Global Ship Intelligence website. And last week, there were already hundreds in the eastern section of the Northern Sea route. I would say almost 1,000 off Norway. And they were clustered around Iceland. In Canada and Alaskan waters, from Davis Strait all the way to the Beaufort Sea, there was not a single one. And this was in 2016. And certainly the number of Canadian icebreakers that are escorting ships through the Northwest Passage is declining. Now, maybe there's less ice problems, but maybe there are fewer icebreakers. Ship traffic is already on the rise within the NORDREG zone, and most notable growth of size are commercial fishing and cargo ships, as well as the small size cruise ship and pleasure craft. Problem with the military, those pleasure crafts are the ones that may be more likely to break the law than any others. Not always, but it's under suspicion sometimes. As of last December, we had only 5 major mines still operating in the NWT in Nunavut, plus the Raglan mine in northern Quebec. The Meadowbank gold mine, 120 miles north of Baker Lake, is expected to close this year, but 2 nearby mines are expected to begin production. Meadowbank, curiously enough, is considered a low Arctic mine by its owners. The Nunavut mines require their own port facilities to bring in heavy equipment and export the ore. The diamond mines in the NWT do not need ports at all. They all have road access. Not shown here is the Raglan mine, large nickel, copper, with access to Deception Bay on Hudson Strait. It's now owned by Glencore Group, an international resource company with headquarters in Bern, Switzerland. It operates year-round, storing its ore at the ports facility during the winter months. But plus point, as in the case of the Mary River and Meadowbank mines, Raglan has successfully trained and integrated Inuit into their workforce. Their success may encourage others. Prior to last summer, tourist travel through the Northwest Passage was also steadily increasing, particularly smaller vessels, as I noted before, even sailboats, sometimes referred to by the Coast Guard as adventure seekers. Visits by small-sized cruise ships are particularly welcomed by Inuit communities, who charge for putting on special performances and gain benefit from sale of Inuit carvings and handcrafts. But the large cruise ship, like the Crystal Serenity up in your upper left there, pose difficulties as there's no docking facilities whatever anywhere in Nunavut. Visiting a community requires taking passengers ashore by zodiacs or lifeboats, feasible for the small cruise ships like there, but not ones the size of the Serenity. Yet, according to the Barents Observer, the Arctic cruise ship industry anticipates a significant growth with the addition of 28 ice-capable vessels over the next 4 years. Some might consider it an opportunity, others a challenge. One item that Bob Ray didn't mention was fisheries. In 2015, Inuit-owned Baffin Fisheries acquired Inuksuk Fisheries, which owned a number of ships and a large factor freezer trawler. One of them is seen there. With the acquisition of yet another and more ships, Baffin Fisheries now claim to be the largest seafood harvesting company in Nunavut. Cumberland Sound Fisheries is another success story. After the docks were built for their boats, its parent company, Cumberland Sound Fishery, local Inuit, after the docks were installed, it was local Inuit that actually bought out Pangnertung freezing plant and their fishery operation from the Nunavut Development Corps. And the company employs about 80 Inuit, summer and winter. Winter, they set out on skidoos and with post-string nets under the ice. In 2017 winter, they hauled in almost 500,000 kilograms of turbot for export. And at $1.35 per pound, that translated to roughly $1.5 million. Other communities in Nunavut are obviously eyeing similar situations. Okay, the challenges or threats. Arctic warming, and there are serious challenges. Inconsistent ice conditions, lack of a major deep sea port, one where you can get repairs and get refueled. Coast Guard's aging fleet of icebreakers, uncharted waters causing grounding of ships, increased pollution from gray water, black carbon particles, and other emissions. And I might add, I don't know whether I dare, the federal government's moratorium on offshore drilling. Last summer, conditions on the Northwest Passage took a sudden turn for the worst. The extent of sea ice had increased very little, but old ice, marked in red on your upper right, had loosened from the ice cap with winds and waves taking huge chunks southward, and it blocked narrow gaps in the passage. As you can see from the lower right, the ice chart. As a result, in early August, the Coast Guard issued a warning that the passage was severely blocked and Icebreaker Escort was no longer available. Those waiting at Greenland, mostly small craft, simply returned home. And only 2 vessels transited the entire passage last summer. 2 small craft, both from Germany, who made it through in July before the heavy ice barrier closed the passage. NORDREG has been remarkably successful in controlling traffic. Out of a small station in Iqaluit that looks onto Frobisher Bay, a team of 11 Coast Guard staff oversee ship traffic throughout Canada's Arctic waters. They once had 15 stations, but because of satellite technology, they can now combine both surveillance and communications in the one center. From here, they keep track of all foreign and domestic ships of a certain size, but they are dependent on an effective icebreaker fleet, helicopter reconnaissance, and assistance from Canada's ice surface for aerial surveillance. So far, they've done a masterful job. But, in terms of icebreakers, In 2018, if I'm to believe the Russian chart, Russia owned 42 icebreakers. I know 2, I believe, were decommissioned, but I know also that a new one was launched a couple of months ago. 5 more are under construction, and plans for a nuclear-powered one is on the drawing board. Norway has just 1, but they have a private company that has a number for charter and sale. The United States, at the moment, has only 1 heavy-duty icebreaker left in service, Polar Star, and currently it's under repair. 1 medium weight, the Healy. Up until last fall, Canada had only 2 heavyweight icebreakers for use in the Arctic, along with 4 medium-sized, one of which was assigned specifically for research. Well, frustrated with the government's failure to recognize the need to replenish the fleet, last spring the Canadian Coast Guard announced it had begun to search for used icebreakers. Actually, Terry Fox, which was about 25 years ago, was a used icebreaker as well. Procurement policy requiring competitive bids seemed to be set aside, and in months, the Coast Guard reported that they would be buying 3 used heavy-duty icebreakers from a Norwegian company. Now, this procurement policy, I understand, they announced that they were buying and then allowed competitive bids to come in for a month, and nobody complied. Anyway, $610 million contract for purchase and retrofitting of all 3 was awarded to the Chantier Davy of Levi, Quebec. In 2012, that shipyard had been sold to, I can't pronounce the name, based in Europe. Under new management, Davy had made its mark by turning surplus ships into low-cost solutions. It has been suggested that the $610 million to purchase and refit 3 used icebreakers is likely half the cost of building one on the Canadian shipyard. Christened the Captain Molly Cool after the first female captain and master mariner, the first was launched for a trial run last November and officially handed over to the Coast Guard in December. It is now in service and will be assigned to the Arctic next summer. The 2nd and 3rd vessels will be added to the fleet in the next fall and the following summer, respectively. This was, again, I repeat, the Coast Guard's first addition to its icebreaker fleet in 25 years. Once Canada's only Arctic deep-sea port, Port Churchill, is now closed. An American company had acquired the port's facilities and the Hudson Bay Railway from the Canadian government in 1997, but shut the port in 2016 because it failed to make a profit after the wheat board was abandoned. Spring floods in 2017 severely damaged the rail line, leaving the Churchill community isolated with air access only. After refusing to repair the damage, the company finally sold both the port facilities and the railway to Arctic Gateway Group, which is a limited partnership of Canadian investors, and with First Nations representatives. The railway connection was restored last fall, but work is still ongoing to repair the damage to the port, and I honestly was unable to get any news as to when or if shipments will resume and to where. On your right is the remnants of a deep-sea port, quote, at Nanisivik, promised by the Harbour government, and now it's just a refueling station for government ships. Promises of port facilities for Iqaluit predate the creation of Nunavut. Finally, in 2005, a consultant's report laid out a plan for a single wharf that would allow dockage of a supply ship, possibly a small-sized cruise ship. Frustrated with further delays, last April, the Nunavut government, and I wish David was here, I could congratulate him, called an end to any further review and requested the original funds be allocated to 2 projects, one for the resupply ships and the other for local watercraft. See the red circles on the upper left there. and plans for the new port are on the lower left. Described now as a deep water port, not a deep sea port. Plans also include connection to the existing pipeline for safety and efficiency of getting oil into the community. And the causeway and the access road will also see improvements. And across the bay, the existing small craft harbor will be expanded with added protection. A local construction firm in the business for over 40 years was immediately hired, and last August, blasting began at the port site on your upper right. Local officials expect both projects to be completed over the summer and ready for use in 2020. After years of broken promises and delay, Iqaluit will have new docking facilities, thanks to the Nunavut government. You can do it if you put your mind to it. Challenges for the mining industry. And I'm going to use the Mary River mine as an example because the time and the high cost in bringing a claim into production are likely the two major deterrents to future development. In 1962, a large iron deposit on northern Baffin was cited by AIR, but it was another 30 years before a claim was actually acquired by the Baffinland Iron Mines. Surveying took another 20 years. And after a series of environmental rules and changes in the company ownership, the open pit mine finally began year-round operation in 2017 with two major sites, the mine on the Mary River, upper left, and a large shipping port at Millen Inlet on your lower right, connected by a 100-kilometer road over which the ore is hauled by heavy-duty dump trucks. Now, shipping also poses a threat to the environment. And for example, the black carbon soot is a common pollutant produced by large vessels through incomplete oxidation of diesel fuel. When in air, they absorb sunlight and generate heat into the atmosphere. In 2014, it was estimated that 609 tons of black carbon had been released into the Arctic atmosphere. Although the International Marine Organization succeeded in passing a mandatory polar code to strengthen ships sailing in Arctic waters, it has still been unable to get a consensus on a mandatory use of light oil to lower the carbon emissions. This is the importance of getting cooperation. Uncharted waters. Concern for the safety of cruise ships began when the Explorer sank in Antarctica in November 2007 and escalated in 2010 after the grounding on an unmarked shoal of another cruise ship in the Canadian Arctic. This time 142 passengers plus crew remained on board the listing ship for 3 days until finally rescued by a Coast Guard icebreaker. Other ships have also been grounded on unmarked shoals, but they're usually trawlers, tugboats, and even on one occasion I know for sure was a supply boat. But these rarely attract the attention of the southern media. Concerns, however, were again raised last summer when another cruise ship, the academic Ioffe, seen on your lower right, ran aground in the Gulf of Bluefia and it never got through the Northwest Passage. This was near Cougarark, Johaven. But fortunately, the 162 passengers were quickly evacuated to a nearby sister ship, who was also trying to get through Bellot Strait. Of particular interest is that photo of the Ioffe on your lower right, taken by a evacuated passenger from a Zodiac, which shows relatively calm waters and no sign of ice. Although investigations are still going, it is a well-known fact that these waters are still largely uncharted. Ironically, I was on the Explorer the summer before it sunk, and the Ioffe in 2011. But would I go back on as a resort? Yes. I trust the captains. I just wish they would get the waters charted. Okay, is Canada prepared? Again, back to my initial quotation. In the past, the Canadian government has missed many opportunities to develop its Arctic resources, leaving it instead to private enterprise. The situation changed dramatically in the past decade, primarily because policies and proposals are no longer dictated by Southern politicians, influenced by budget limitations, instead of being briefly consulted. Inuit and Northern First Nations are now included in the planning and approval process. Traditional knowledge and experience is not only proving valuable, but lengthy review processes are being cut short, sometimes even bypassed. Results of this change were first observed in construction of the Arctic Research Centre at Cambridge Bay and the new airport in Iqaluit, the latter under construction for 3 years, at a cost of $300 million. That doesn't seem a lot for an airport, especially when the new terminal is 8 times the size of the original, reportedly large enough to serve Nunavut for the next 50 years. With continued investment in infrastructure, the capital of Nunavut is preparing for future prosperity. Belatedly, perhaps, but more in line with its neighbor, Nuuk, in Greenland. Russia's ability to expedite development with its massive funding may seem impressive, but it's because of ownership of its Arctic resources. But Russia's objective is to become a economic superpower, and that's not one shared by Canada. Concerned more about protecting our Arctic sovereignty than building a sustainable economy, Canada has tended to leave development of its Arctic resources in the hands of corporations, some unfortunately foreign-owned. Not only does Canada lose control, as in the case of Port of Churchill, but profits go elsewhere. In the last decade, however, Canada appears to have changed course and adopted a strategy of developing its Arctic for the benefit of the people who live there. In time, this new approach might even strengthen the overall Canadian economy by reducing the Arctic region's dependency on federal financial support. But hopefully we can leave history behind and continue to move forward, and more importantly, do so in a manner that will slow the progress of Arctic warming. Meanwhile, the sea ice is still melting and the polar bears are hungry. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak to you all and to listen to a really fascinating conversation so far. And I would like to thank the RCMI both for the invitation and their very, very warm hospitality. You have seen an awful lot of slideshows, so I'm not sure, I won't use all of mine, but there are a couple. I'm having a bad couple of tech days from the beginning. There we go. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay, so I would just like to, hopefully you read my bio. I'm Canada's senior Arctic official, which means basically that I represent Canada at the Arctic Council senior officials table. That's a pretty obvious conclusion. We meet on a regular basis in 2-year cycles. Every 2 years ministers meet, and that is a platform for cooperation, multilateral cooperation of the 8 Arctic states. That's kind of the core of what I do, but I have a broader responsibility on international Arctic issues. I also have a geographic remit as the Director General responsible for managing our bilateral relations with the region we call Eastern Europe and Eurasia. So that includes Russia. It includes a lot of other countries, but I mention Russia in particular because it is also an Arctic state, and one where our bilateral relationship is seen better days right now, shall we say. So So it's an interesting portfolio, a complex portfolio, and one that is very, very interesting, and like the Arctic, is changing a great deal. My job here today is to give you an overview of our global engagement on international Arctic issues. So I would like to do that by starting with a brief overview of the Canadian North, and I know we've heard a lot about the Canadian North, but in particular, I think it is important, we've talked a lot about the people. This gives you a bit of a demographic breakdown of just who those people are, and I know you're going to hear later from Krista about the national Arctic reality, but who the people are in Canada's North is an important driver for the posture that we take internationally. The communities there, the realities of the communities there, their small number, their vast geographic spread, the predominantly Indigenous character of the people there, the work that has been done over the last 30 years on self-government. So you see the Inuit homeland of the 4 areas, only 3 shown on this map. All of this is an important context for what we do internationally on the Arctic and how we do it. Basically, I would cite 4 of the government's key priorities come together when we talk about international Arctic issues. So that is their commitment to multilateral engagement as a vehicle for solving or addressing global challenges and threats, support for the rules-based international order, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and finally, and very importantly, the fight to combat climate change. We're at a very important juncture in the work that we do internationally. For those of you who read the budget, I'm not sure about listening to the budget speech because I don't think it actually was mentioned, but there were announcements on international Arctic as part of a larger set of announcements relating to investment in our north. And again, I know Krista will be speaking to that more. But it basically, the announcements that were made in the budget would address, I would say, the point that we have heard here today, that Canada needs to fill the leadership space more effectively. And so we are at an exciting time in seeing now funding allocations that will bolster our international leadership. Overall, there was over $700 million announced for the Arctic writ large in the last budget. Of that, $34 million is for international Arctic, and that is going to enable us to not only increase the capacity, government capacity to participate in multilateral and bilateral conversations, but also the capacity of our Indigenous peoples, of our universities, of our many stakeholders to participate in international conversations about the Arctic at a time when, as we've heard today, it's becoming ever more accessible with changing and unpredictable conditions. So what does that global engagement look like? I want to talk about our bilateral engagement and our multilateral engagement, and I will try not to go into too many details, and we'll leave that for questions and comments. You've heard today that the Circumpolar Arctic is known for its stability and for its high level of international cooperation. So our premise is that in the Circumpolar North, we do have a strong and reasonably flexible rules-based international order. And we can look at the work of the Arctic Council, but also other related and unrelated multilateral work in the area that would support that premise. So it hasn't happened by accident. It has happened because of years of concerted efforts to identify common priorities and to work together where we can to address those common challenges. Increasingly, of course, we're seeing it important not to do that only regionally and bilaterally with Arctic states, but also with non-Arctic states who are interested in participating in these conversations and in benefiting from the changes that are happening in the Arctic, but also who feel threatened by what climate change is going to do to the Arctic and the impact that that's going to have further south. So as the what we would say owner, 25% of the Arctic, we do see the need to broaden that engagement. An imperative to work with those countries to work in areas of common interest and to really leverage where we see shared priorities, pooling resources, pooling technology, all with a view to mitigating threats and maximizing opportunities. But for the heart of it for us is really about the communities that are in the Arctic. Communities in the Arctic who's largely Indigenous, whose gaps in terms of education, health, social indicators, for a variety of reasons are very, very different than they are in southern Canada. So a lot of the work that we are doing internationally is about supporting and empowering those communities to drive their own prosperity and to adapt to the changes that are coming. To tie that to the sovereignty conversation, and here I'm going to channel a little bit our legal advisor, Alan Kessel, for those of you who know him. Arctic sovereignty, well, he says we don't talk about the sovereignty of Toronto, so why do we talk about the sovereignty of the Arctic? That's kind of his bottom line. This is, the Arctic is as Canadian as Toronto or Winnipeg or Vancouver. There is no military threat that is facing the Arctic right now. If we talk about threats and risks, we would say point really to the threats of climate change as much as anything else. That is not to say that there is any lack of appreciation of the need for vigilance and for surveillance, but at the same time, a broader definition of sovereignty would see thriving communities, prosperity, community education, all of those social and economic dimensions of a society to be as much a part of sovereignty as effective defense and what was I going to say? Effective defense and surveillance, that's what I was going to say. So, moving from that then to Canada at the Arctic Council. I start with the Arctic Council because that really is our preeminent intergovernmental forum for cooperation on the Arctic. That's true for Canada. You would hear the same line from, I would say, every one of the Arctic 8. And those Arctic 8, just for those of you not familiar with the Arctic Council, it's Canada, the US, the 5 Nordics, Iceland, Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and then Russia, and hopefully I have them all. So those are the Arctic 8. The Arctic Council, established in 1996, as somebody said earlier today, very much a Canadian initiative, and a Canadian initiative that was strongly advocated by Mary Simon and Iqaluit. So right from the very moment of the Arctic Council's establishment, there was a recognition that a platform, an intergovernmental platform, was necessary that would provide a voice for the Indigenous peoples of the North, so that the work of governments would be informed by perspectives of those who live there and the needs of those who live there, and it has continued to that day. So unlike any other intergovernmental forum, there are the 8 member states, and we sit at the table with 6 what we call permanent participants. And these are representatives of international organizations from the Circumpolar 8. 3 of them have Canadian chapters. They are not part of the decision-making accountabilities of the Council. That rests with governments, but it is a consensus body. And I would say in my experience in this job, almost 3 years, I have not seen the Council move in a direction that was fundamentally opposed by any permanent participant. It's not a treaty-based body. It's a body formed by a declaration, I think probably the only one in the world with an asterisk, and that asterisk exempts military security from its mandate. So we come together to talk about what we can do together in thematic areas. So this, I think, is a particular approach to multilateralism that has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages. In working together where we can, that means that we're not necessarily working together where we should or where we must. There isn't any discussion around where do we need to work together, where do we need to challenge one another. It is really an effort to let's collaborate where we can. But that has accomplished a number of very important gains, I would say. We have seen it spark 3 treaties. So we now have a treaty on search and rescue. We have a treaty on oil spill prevention and preparedness, and we have the newest one, a treaty on Arctic scientific cooperation. And that is a treaty that has a particular paragraph on the importance of incorporating traditional knowledge. So while it is not itself a treaty-based body, it has demonstrated the capacity to catalyze treaty-based negotiations that are really, I would say, demonstrating a strategic capacity to identify where we need to work together and where we actually do need international laws and norms in a changing world. So that's the Arctic Council. Canada, the Arctic Council, I would say is, I'm not sure I need to say all that much more about it. I would hark back to what I said at the outset. In terms of our posture on international Arctic, it is very much informed by the communities and the people that live in the Arctic. And that means that at the council table, we very much look to champion the socio-economic work, to ensure that the work that the council does is keeping in mind the people. Now, that's not to say that it disregards the environment, disregards flora and fauna, but we understand all of these things to be connected, that a healthy environment is critical for a healthy community. I'll just say a couple of words on the current round of the Arctic Council. We're heading towards the ministerial. We take turns chairing it. So we last chaired it from 2013 to 2015. The Americans took over from us. The Finns are doing it right now. We're heading towards a ministerial in early May, are working hard to land on a declaration. It's an ongoing negotiation. We had a bit of a difficult time getting to a declaration in Fairbanks. I would say that there are similar challenges right now. So while there is a recognition and appreciation of the value of solidarity amongst the Arctic 8, in other words, we need to demonstrate to the international community that we, the Arctic 8, can be effective and efficient in addressing the challenges that we face. So there is power in unity, but there are policy differences right now amongst the 8 that are making it difficult to land on particular language. I just wanted to mention a few other areas of multilateral cooperation and then move on to bilateral cooperation. I think most of this audience knows that the Arctic itself is a marine area that is by and large under the jurisdiction of national governments. The exception is right up at the top, where projections are. We'll see periods that are ice-free. Probably as the first time ever, a negotiation on how to manage an eventual commercial fishery up there concluded, I think, 2 years ago. This brought together the Arctic 5 as the Arctic Ocean coastal states with non-Arctic players, including the EU and the North Asians, to conclude a treaty on high seas fisheries that would apply a preventative principle, take an evidence-based view on how to ensure sustainability of the fishery up there. So it's another example of the rules-based international order actually responding effectively to a challenge. Bilateral cooperation. Just to say a few words, of course, amongst the Arctic 8, we have many of Canada's traditional partners and allies. There is one member, Russia, with whom we have a more complicated and difficult relationship, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. The Arctic, however, Arctic cooperation has maintained a collaborative dynamic. There is a recognition that we need to talk, that we need to work together, we need to cooperate, because the challenges are today, and particularly I would say Canada and Russia, together 75% of the Arctic, we face many of the same challenges and priorities. Theirs is very different. I won't go over that because others already have today, but on issues like infrastructure challenges, permafrost thaw, there are a lot of very similar priorities. So we can and do work and collaborate well with Russia. Bilateral beyond that, we are looking to enhance our dialogue with the European Union, with, of course, China, with Japan, with Korea, all of whom have long-standing investments in polar science, are very interested in working together with us. Particularly in scientific cooperation, we are indeed complicated, so we are working on that. I think I'm probably close to the end of my. So the one other issue that I did want to mention was continental shelf. So the negotiations on the continental shelf, work has been underway on that for 20 years. Canada is about to put in its submission. Someone referred to Russia making a bid for the North Pole. My understanding is there is an anticipation of competing bids that will all go in to the UN Commission on the Polar Continental Shelf. That will take some years to get the science out of that, and then there will be a negotiation. So I think this is an area where, as with some others, we need to bring some perspective to the issue of who is doing what in the Arctic. As we look forward, I think that we continue to be very much focused on achieving sustainable economic growth in a way that empowers our communities up there, and in ways that builds resilience, assists adaptation, and continues to maintain the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation. And so with that, I think I will close. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any comments or questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you both, Shelagh and Alison, for very, very informative presentations. We now have some time for questions, so please go to the microphone and identify yourself and ask a question. And Andrea will give you first chance. Yep.
Thank you both very much for the presentations. I'm actually directing my question to Alison, and it's a little unfair. You may not be able to answer it, but one of the concerns with the Arctic Council has been the sort of 3-to-1 ratio we have now, the three representing the many observers, both non-Arctic states, NGOs, and intergovernmental forums, and then the 8 Arctic states and the 6 permanent participants. And Canada was instrumental in coming up with some rules around the behavior expected of non-Arctic states. I was surprised Switzerland was added on. I thought maybe we'd reached our max, but then Switzerland was added on, and I know there are more in the queue, so I won't ask you to comment on that. But one of the ideas from Canada was that there would be regular reviews about whether or not non-Arctic states were actually meeting the mandate, the intent of the Arctic Council. I'm not sure if you can maybe comment on that, or if there are any non-governmental organizations, especially ones associated with insurance for marine vessels, those sorts of organizations, if they're maybe in the queue.
So that's what I use. Okay. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah, the question around observers in the Arctic Council is a source of lively discussion. The ratio itself, I would say, is not intrinsically problematic. If you look at the UN, maybe it's not a fair comparison. There's 100 and, what are we at, 193 now? There are 3,000 observers to the UN. Not in, our view, the Canadian view is that there are ways of managing observer engagement in the council without creating artificial ceilings. So we would never want to say, okay, that's it, because, and it's important to understand why, there was a commitment when the Arctic Council was established that we would meet in the north. So that means by definition, we're meeting in small communities. And for those, I think, Christy, you might have been one, I only hear the stories of the ministerial that we hosted in Iqaluit in 2015. It was, and the Secretary of State came, and it was very, very difficult. So that's the challenge. But in our view, is you can set up rules, whether it's first come, first serve, or to manage that. And we should always leave open the possibility, if there is an observer, whether it is a state or a non-governmental organization, that can make a really solid contribution to the council's work, then we should be open to considering that, and that does remain the case. The review does get done. I can, because I'm not going to name the country, there has been at least one case, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. It wasn't done regularly. The Americans started to do it in their last chairmanship, and we are now keeping it up. There was one report of concern, and the chair did go back and speak to that government about whether or not they wanted to maintain the observership. So there is a degree of due diligence that is done. Those criteria, the new criteria for us, particularly important that there is a recognition of the particular status and role of Indigenous peoples. We want to see that reflected in those reports. But I would say it's more of a performance assessment in terms of providing feedback. You mentioned economic associations and organizations, and that I would say there is a bit of a lively debate that hasn't quite landed yet. I didn't mention the Arctic Economic Council that was formed at the end of our chairmanship, our last chairmanship, and a Canadian initiative, is a private sector platform. So there is a lively debate about whether it is observers, that private sector should have status as an observer in the Arctic Council, or whether they should apply for membership to the Arctic Economic Council. It goes on. But there is a recognition, I would say, across the council that observers do have an important contribution to make. If I could just beg Whitney's indulgence, one project in particular that I just think makes the case so clearly is a long-standing Arctic Council project on Arctic migratory birds. So this is an initiative that tracks what they call flyways. So birds when they fly north and south. So that's an important food source for our northern Indigenous peoples in spring. But the populations have been falling radically because the flyways are getting industrialized. So those that migrate down to, south of South America, what were wetlands are now suburbs kind of thing. So this has been an important work of scientific assessment and tracking, but you can see where we need to work with non-Arctic states if we're going to address the health of those flyways so that when the birds come to the Arctic in the spring, they remain healthy. So it's just one example of where you can see the role of observer states and where they can contribute.
Great, thanks both of you for your presentations. Quick questions, but probably big ones, maybe unfair ones. Alison, through this rather long protracted period of consultations the Government of Canada has been undergoing in anticipation of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, could you share with us one or two tidbits of things that have come out of those consultations that have been most surprising to you? So through that process, some things that maybe have encouraged different ways of looking at Canada's place within the Circumpolar North, and I'll leave it open-ended like that. Sheila, if you were able to identify the one key priority for funding for the Government of Canada to see elevated in budget 2020 to address some of the issues that you have raised here, what would it be?
My answer is pretty quick, because Chris is much better placed to answer that question. So in the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, global affairs led on the international dimension. You know that, yeah. And Krista, I think, will be speaking to that. So I will speak to the international dimension. I think I would say that it was a lot easier than we were expecting it to be. In that, you know, if foreign policy is not something that is co-developed, typically, federal jurisdiction, one that's not given away easily. But we did take a very collaborative approach. We do have a consultative platform called the Arctic Council Advisory Committee, where we do meet with provincial and territorial governments, with Indigenous peoples, with other stakeholders. And in terms of what we heard and the reception we got to our proposals, we landed on common space fairly easily. From what I heard of the extent that I've been involved in the domestic one, I would also say that it was more, I found it validating more than enlightening in a way, in that what we heard is what we had heard from Mary Simon, and consistent with our posture at the Arctic Council, that the people who live there want the same things for their families that we want for ours, and are very interested in having investments for infrastructure deficits, for connectivity, for local education, local health care. So as I say, I would say validating. But Krista will, I think in her presentation, will speak about it.
And if Krista doesn't, you can address it yourself at the end of the day.
I agree with you totally. I probably had trips to Baffin Island. I think I counted 27 in my career, and the changes are enormous, but the people are the same. They're, you know, I couldn't find that culturally they had traditions that were different than ours, but you know, they want the same thing for their children. Question though, I think I can answer it, Whitney. The one thing I would advise, number one priority, huge commitment on infrastructure. I don't, ports, a deep sea port, if you look what even Nuuk has, where they can repair ships, they can store, they can refuel, they can repair damage. And not just one. I think we need Western Arctic and Eastern Arctic as well. The others will trickle down the infrastructure and for fishing boats. That's probably been the biggest. Out of that, well, everything will flow, I think. Maybe. Whether they do it or not, that's another question. Thank you, Whitney. Good question.
Okay, Henry, your turn.
Thank you. My comment and question to both speakers. Given my window into the cruise and expedition industry, I've taken note of what seems to be a growing standard practice of them leasing Russian icebreakers to traverse our northern waters. And I guess in following up to the previous speaker about priority, that seems to underline the importance of icebreakers, because going back to speakers from this morning, if there are Russian icebreakers, there will be other Russian nationals on board, and what else could be going on? So my question is because it hasn't been mentioned yet, have we considered that dimension of the increase in the tourism? And does that not underline the urgency of getting a larger domestic icebreaker fleet to escort these ships?
Good question. I think I can answer that. The two IOFI ships that are current Russian, but they're actually operated by OneQuest. which is a tourist company that is based out of Canada. But they use the ships because there aren't that many available. And I think the Arctic icebreaker or Arctic tourist industry itself, that's one of the reasons for this 28 new. You're going to need less of a total icebreaker. And the academic IOFI, and I forget the name of the other one, they had a lot of, mind you, they had a lot of equipment on board, but all the staff were fluent English. The captain wasn't. He was very Russian. The mate was not. But I don't think that's as big a threat as the uncontrollable smaller boats that are coming across as adventure seekers. And they are not, that's not mandatory if they're not 300 tons. And they're the ones that they can sort of look at what they've got in their hold and what they tend to drop off at a community, etc. But I think the academic IOFI and its sister ship is an exception to that. I don't see it as a threat, quite frankly.
So I would just add, I guess, that as Sheila said, when ships like that go through there, they apply and are permitted, so there is oversight there. Yeah, they're inspected, but that actually also is relevant to the sovereignty conversation. I think it's worth noting in that any application to go through Canadian waters is a recognition of Canadian waters. So there are advantages, right, to having this international traffic in the sovereignty conversation as well.
I had another thought. When on one trip we came from Greenland to Lindhout, and we had to, all of us had to wait on board till Coast Guard vessel came, bringing the customs, and we had to, each one of us had to go through customs as if we were going from any port one to the other. That part's pretty tight, and they do investigate. I mean, the cruise ships are examined what they're carrying, who they're carrying, etc. That one's not as bad as the little guys.
Another question? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I truly appreciate many of your comments. I'd like to build on something, first of all, that Adam McDonald said this morning, and then most of my comments are going to be directed, I think, towards Dr. Grant. It has to do with the viability of actually meaningful, reasonable development in the north, okay? With 120,000 people, there's no tax base. And no Canadian wants to see their southern dollars, tax dollars, spent in the north in an abstract sense for an area they don't really understand. So there is a need for what I would call a consolidated and integrated approach with all sectors of society, including the private sector, under proper, reasonable rules and orders to see things develop. But one of the things, having been involved in the north for decades, I was there when the Manhattan went through. I was there for the Canadian Arctic Gas Pipeline and the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and all that sort of thing. I want to read you from a little bit of a report that was produced in June of 2018 by a Commons Committee called Nation Building at Home, Vigilance Beyond, Preparing for the Coming Decades in the Arctic. And there's a reference there that says, and I quote, this relates to the Trudeau-Obama decision to ban Arctic drilling, which is largely done by private enterprises. And this is the quote. The manner in which that decision was carried out was not described warmly by the people with whom the committee met in the north. There was a feeling that the decision had been made without consideration of the interests of the people who live and work there. One Indigenous organization received 20 minutes notice. to appear post-COVID. So I'm asking a question. We're doing a lot of talking. We're talking with neighboring countries with equivalent interest, but we are really engaging with the people in the north, and we're really listening to what they see, what they need, what they want. And when it takes 5 or 6 years to repair a simple harbor, something's wrong. Would you care to comment on that?
I'd love to. Actually, I'm sorry that was a paragraph I cut trying to get on the, good news. Yes, the moratorium's there, and I mentioned it. What I didn't mention, that in the last 2 years, there has been a clawback, and they are meeting with both NWT, but mostly in Nunavut, with government and some local representatives, and they're pushing, I think the local input are pushing for, why can't we produce enough gas to get rid of the diesel that fuels the Arctic communities? And the word was it's under review, and not with Southerners, it's under review with the Northerners. So I'm a little hopeful. Thank you. Good question.
Go ahead, ask.
My name is Frankie Griffiths, and I wrote a question about the Arctic Council, maybe though both of you might like to consider. Some years ago, the Arctic Council sponsored a Arctic climate assessment, and they got a lot of attention. It helped raise awareness about what was going on in the Arctic and with regard to climate change and global warming. Since then, the Arctic has continued to heat up at a rate ever more pronounced than in the rest of the world. My question has to do with, is there something now the Arctic can do for a repeat performance, the Arctic Council? Could there be something in the pipeline even now? And is Canada proposing anything like this? I would say this is an important consciousness-raising task the Council has to reach out to the wider world, to tell it about stuff that we know and our Indigenous people, above all, know very much more intimately than anyone else, and we should speak. At the same time, there's a problem. Of the Arctic Council, of the 8, Russia, Norway, the USA, Canada, are all heavily dependent on the extraction of oil and gas. We love it. How can we speak against global warming in the Arctic Council when we live off the proceeds of global warming?
So, to your first question, it is the point about monitoring and assessment, those continue. And the Arctic Council has an excellent track record in producing regular assessments and evaluations on the climate, on snow, water, and ice. That's another one that is well known, the Spike-Up report as it's called. It was last done in 2017. So the Arctic Council is fundamentally really it's a body of sort of scientific and technical bodies, social science and natural science. So that brings together experts in the 8 countries and does an awful lot of good work. How well known is it? Is really such a key question, and it is one that it is actually, in the work that we have done over the last 2 years on a strategic plan, one of the things that we have highlighted is the need to do exactly that. Getting the message out has been challenging for the Arctic Council. Doing that outreach, the communications. The first time I saw a real headline from an Arctic Council report, I later learned that it was the work of a philanthropic foundation in the States who embarked on and put some real muscle behind marketing to bring that attention, that report to the media. So the work does get done. It is not, we have to get better at communications, and there are capacity challenges with that. With respect to climate change, I think it's what we say, working in the Arctic, climate change is not a result of any of activities in the Arctic. It is a result of activities elsewhere. And governments are acting in the context of the Paris Accord, and that's the platform on which I would say that Canada speaks to what it's doing in terms of both greenhouse gases and more particularly, you saw it, I think on one of your slides, the SOOT, the black carbon and methane emissions, and we can point to progress. We can point to progress not just on climate change, greenhouse gases, but also on other pollutants in the air that, as a result of work both within and outside the Arctic Council, are seeing some progress.
The only thing to your question, how can we as a Canadian country that are producing so much oil ourselves promote, climate, relief of climate change? I think Russia has already caught on. They have their oil exports are almost reduced as fast that they're pushing. And unfortunately...
Closer.
Yeah, it just needs to be a little closer.
Okay, if in fact we can somehow get the transition from reliance on oil and get it into light oil, and get it, we have to work on this transition phase too. We can't go home again. We can't go backwards. So we have to adapt somehow, and it's going to take a while for Alberta to come around, I understand. And we do need pipelines. They aren't nearly as dangerous as taking it by carload or train load. We have to stop the initial panic protests that used to come out a decade ago and start rethinking reality and transition. Where did it come from? That was a good question.
Could I just ask a follow-up question to that? Does that mean if you want to transition from the heavy oil to the lighter oil, does that mean that Canada needs more refining capacity? So that becomes part of the infrastructure development.
But at the same time, again, looking at work being done in the Arctic Council, there was an awful lot of really good work being done on renewables. And also particularly renewables in remote communities that are off-grid. And that is an important dimension too, and the Arctic Council is a place where a lot of good work is being done.
Okay, I want to take this opportunity and to thank our two panelists. Again, they've given us a lot of information, but I particularly appreciate the focus on there are people living there who want for their families what we all want for our families, who are focused on development, on growth, exactly as we are anywhere else in Canada. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because they are entitled to their opportunities to develop, and we should be careful not to let certain attitudes or lack of attitudes and knowledge prevent that from happening. So thank you very much, both of you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.